There are, no doubt, plenty of conspiracies that surround the Vatican, ranging from connections to organized crime and secret societies to allegiances to the intelligence agencies and several unsavory political leaders. The conspiracy claims of the Chronovisor, though, an alleged technological device that allows those in possession of it to see back in time, are arguably some of the most intriguing and thought-provoking. Mainstream attention was brought to the alleged device in the 2002 book The Vatican's New Mystery by Father Francois Brune, who claimed that the person who built it had confided in him a short time later. However, an Italian newspaper had run an article about a machine in the Vatican's possession that could take photographs of the past as far back as 1972. In short, for a device that doesn't exist, there was a lot of coverage of it. According to the article, the origins of this curious device go back to the early 1950s. A one-time Italian physicist who later became a priest, Father Ernetti, was in charge of the Chronovisor project. He created a device that was structured entirely from precious alloys with a special screen that connected to tuning dials and tubing. During the process, he claimed to have had the help of 12 world-class scientists, including Nobel Prize winner Enrico Fermi, also a physicist who served in an advisory capacity, often passing on information that would prove important to the project's eventual success. Ernetti would also receive, according to him, private advice from former SS member turned leading NASA rocket scientist through Operation Paperclip, Werner von Braun. That such great minds would share such advice perhaps suggests some kind of vested interest. Although the Chronovisor didn't physically take a person back in time, the idea was that it did allow those who utilized it to see directly into the past, with some claims stating it also allowed viewing into the very near future. In the 1972 newspaper article, Ernetti explains how various processes would produce residual electromagnetic radiation, and it was this that the Chronovisor used in order to work. It would then use this energy to tap into the frequencies of space-time itself and then show moving images that appeared almost exactly as a movie film would. He wouldn't, however, go into any elaborate detail on these processes, how they worked or what they involved, nor would he discuss the device's location, elaborating that if someone who had more malevolent desires came into possession of the Chronovisor, it could result in the scariest dictatorship the world had ever seen. He did, though, discuss some of the eras in time and events from the past that he had witnessed with the device. For example, he claims to have seen the founding of Rome in 753 BC, as well as the destruction of the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He also claimed that he and fellow scientists involved with the project viewed famous speeches of Napoleon and Mussolini. Perhaps most remarkable of all were his claims that he had witnessed the Last Supper and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In fact, it is claimed by some that it is such events as this that drove the desire to manufacture the device in the first place, to be able to observe the claims of the Bible in particular, the accounts of Jesus, so as to offer proof of their authenticity. Perhaps the fact that the Vatican did not shout of this proof from the rooftops is more telling than we might think. We might imagine, for example, that had they obtained proof of the accuracy of the accounts of the Bible and the life of Jesus, they would have used it to further their cause. That this did not happen, if we assume that the accounts of the Chronovisor are genuine, perhaps suggests that they in fact discovered those accounts were not as credible as the biblical writings claimed. Well, this is the theory. Also, on this last event, Ernetti would even produce a photograph that he claimed showed the face of Jesus. The picture was largely ridiculed and denounced as a fake, something which Ernetti would later admit to. We will return to this admission later, as the timeline of the Chronovisor would take further twists and turns. Perhaps one of the most unsettling twists and potential connections to examine are those of Douglas K. DeVos, who was shot at point-blank range on September 24, 1953. In Los Angeles, California, by a man who claimed he was having an affair with his wife. The gunman was ultimately found guilty of second-degree murder, and the woman concerned denied that anything untoward between herself and Devos had ever taken place. When he was killed, Devos was working on publishing the 4-volume work Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East, the life's work of Baird T. Spalding, who had passed away at the age of 95 several months earlier. Spalding's writings contained insights into the wisdom of the teachings of the Far East, including direct contact with the elders of the Himalayas. Many would accuse Spalding of being a fraud, largely due to a lack of funds on his part that would have allowed him to journey as far and as wide as he had claimed he had done. However, it is the claims of what he did when he returned from his travels that are of most interest to us here. According to Spalding, he would become involved in a project with an engineer called Charles Steinmetz that would look to produce a camera that could peer back in time and even take pictures of events from the past. A device that sounds remarkably similar to the Chronovisor. Could it be that the blueprints for this device were in Devos' possession at the time of his death as he prepared to publish Spalding's life's work? Might he even have been murdered for them? There is admittedly no proof of such claims, but his death and connection to Spalding and his Chronovisor-like device just before the Vatican's version appeared is eyebrow-raising to some at the very least. Might the two devices be one and the same? Were the claims of the Chronovisor nothing more than a bizarre hoax? Several high-ranking members of the Vatican would assert as much. It would, however, surely be strange that a physicist and priest should make such outlandish claims publicly. When Ernetti admitted to the picture of Jesus indeed being a fake, he would insist that he had desperately wished to provide proof of the device's very real existence, but that the powers that be in the Vatican had forbidden anyone from sharing any details of the device publicly under threat of excommunication. We have to ask then, if the Chronovisor was nothing more than a hoax, why would Pope Pius XII put out such an order? Ernetti also claimed that due to the fear that those with less benevolent intentions would gain control of it, the Chronovisor was dismantled following the initial experiments by his team. However, according to some research, the device remains fully assembled and in full working order. There are also claims that connect the intelligence agencies to the Chronovisor. According to a claim made in the tabloid newspapers in 2017, researcher Alfred Weber claimed that he had information he discovered in the WikiLeaks files that stated the Vatican gave information to the CIA on quantum access technology at some point in the 1960s. What's more, he would go even further, stating that the Vatican was a huge influence in the intelligence agency's founding. He would go further still, stating that the Vatican subcontracted the technology of the Chronovisor out to world governments, including most predominantly the British. We might ask if there is any truth to the claims of this device, essentially being rented out to governments around the world. And then for what purpose might they use it? We might recall the claims that the Chronovisor can also be used to see events in the near future. Might certain governments around the world have used the device in order to see the future, perhaps in times of an election or even a potential conflict, and then change their actions accordingly so as to, in turn, change the future? Might it be that our very reality is subject to the peering into the future by people at the upper echelons of the world's governments? Could it be that those in power at any given time can manipulate the unfolding of world events and indeed time itself? Is the Chronovisor a real device that can view events in the past? And if so, is it still in the possession of the Vatican? Might this technology have been contracted out to governments around the world as and when required? And does this device give the Vatican even more power than some would say it already has? Only a power that is exercised from behind the scenes, away from the public. What if you had arranged to meet someone outside a shop on the high street in the mid-1990s, only to find yourself in front of a business that existed there almost half a century earlier? Or what if you went shopping only to purchase the items from a store several decades in the past? As crazy as these scenarios might sound, there are a number of such accounts stemming from one street in the northwest of England, Bold Street in Liverpool. One of the strangest of these sensational accounts occurred in 2006 and was told to a journalist of the Liverpool Echo by a self-confessed shoplifter known in the report as Sean. He claimed that on this particular day, he was running from a security guard down Bold Street when he took a turn down one of the side streets. However, he began to feel a sudden and gripping tightness in his chest, which caused the witness to stop momentarily to catch his breath. As he did so, he noticed that his surroundings appeared completely different from what they had been only moments ago. As he continued on his way once more down Hanover Street and then back to the main road, he noticed that people were dressed in distinctly out-of-date clothing. He spied a newspaper kiosk and made his way to it, still keeping half an eye out for the security guard who had been close behind him only moments earlier. When he got to the kiosk, he reached for one of the newspapers that were stacked neatly in a pile. He quickly located the date, Thursday, May the 18th, 1967. He cast his eyes over his surroundings once more, noting how the clothes did indeed look like they were from the 1960s era. This was the same for the cars and other vehicles on the road. Realizing that something was clearly not right, Sean turned and retraced his footsteps, going back the way he had arrived. He eventually came to the side street he had turned down when running from the security guard. As he progressed down it, the surroundings morphed from the 1960s back to his own time of 2006. However, before he stepped out of the side street, he turned to peer behind him, and to his amazement, as he looked down the alley, he could see the world almost 40 years previously. He would later recall to the Liverpool Echo journalist that he was standing in 2006 and looking quite literally into 1967. The journalist to whom Sean first revealed his encounter would later claim that they had interviewed him on 4 separate occasions, and that each time he relayed the exact same story and had not changed one single detail. Even more intriguing, the journalist, with Sean's help, managed to track down the security guard who had been chasing Sean that day. He would confirm that as he was following him, Sean seemed to have simply vanished into thin air. The journalist found Sean to be completely credible, and that maybe, just maybe, there may have been some credibility to his outlandish story, that a crack in time had appeared on the streets of Liverpool. A decade earlier, in the summer of 1996, another perplexing event is said to have unfolded. Frank and his wife Carol had decided to spend a Saturday afternoon shopping in the many shops along Bold Street. As both wished to purchase different items, they went their separate ways and arranged to meet at a bookshop that Carol had planned to visit. Frank was headed to the record shop, and his walk there was uneventful, at least at first. As Frank passed the Lyceum building, he noticed an unnerving change, as if everything had become suddenly quiet, and then a car horn blasted out from behind him. As Frank turned, he noticed a van had only just avoided crashing into him. Frank quickly stepped to one side, as much in shock from the near miss as he was with the fact that the van had appeared as though it had come straight from the 1950s. As it drove away, he noted the word Kaplan's painted on the side. Now, feeling confused and somewhat disorientated, Frank decided against visiting the record shop and instead made his way straight to the bookshop, Dillon's, where he had arranged to meet up with his wife. When he approached it, though, it didn't look like a bookshop at all, and it wasn't called Dillon's. Instead, the name above the door said Cripps. What's more, as he peered through the window, instead of the latest bestseller, he could see row after row of ladies' clothing, shoes, and handbags. Frank spun around, looking at his surroundings. He was more than shocked to see the bustles of people all suddenly wearing clothing that was reminiscent of the Second World War. As he looked on in bewilderment, a woman who stood out due to her modern attire walked past him and headed into the shop he had just been peering into. Frank turned and followed her inside. However, before he could step through the doorway, the shop morphed into Dylan's bookshop. The woman he had followed, though, was still there, and it was clear to Frank that she was as shocked as he was. After they had taken a few moments to come to their senses, Frank asked the woman if she had noticed anything strange as she had entered the shop. She confirmed she had, claiming that she believed the shop to be a new clothes shop on the street, which is why she had decided to pay it a visit in the first place. When Carol, Frank's wife, finally arrived at the bookshop, Frank remained quiet about his bizarre experience. However, over the following weeks, he would carry out research into the area. And to his amazement, the premises where Dylan's bookshop stood in the mid-1990s was, in the 1950s, a woman's clothes shop named Cripps. Even more remarkable, there was a business operating under the name Kaplan's on the street during the same time. It appeared that Frank had, for reasons unknown or understood, slipped back into the early 1950s, 4 decades into the past. Of course, what might have caused such a slip in time, if it really happened, remains a mystery. One of the most recent time slip cases along Bold Street was documented by researcher Tom Slemons. He would relay the account of a 17-year-old local teenager, Imogen, who had been shopping along the street looking for items for her sister's newborn baby. When she spotted a mother care store, she went inside, certain that they would have most of the items she required. As she walked around the store, placing what she needed in her basket, she marveled at how cheap the prices were. However, when she came to pay, she realized something wasn't quite right. She went to use her debit card when the cashier informed her that the store didn't allow payment by card and accepted cash only. Luckily, the small amount of cash she had on her was enough to cover the cost of the items, and although a little confused, Imogen left the shop and returned home. When she was telling her mother of the strange affair later that evening, though, both women suspected something truly out of the ordinary had taken place. Not least as the building Imogen insisted was mother care had not been so for several years and was, in fact, now a bank. Had she somehow slipped into the past, temporarily without her realizing it, purchasing items from an era as a bizarre souvenir? It would certainly appear that way to some. What the cause of these bizarre time slip encounters might be remains a topic of debate among paranormal researchers. Some people suggest that there could be a connection to the underground rail system, which forms a perfect circle under the city and Bold Street. Although there is no explanation as to the hows and whys, some researchers have put forward that the circular nature of the line and the high voltage energy involved may force portals or gateways to temporarily open. While this might be a proposition that is easy to dismiss as fanciful to begin with, it perhaps takes on a little more credence when we learn that all of the accounts on record of time slips connected to Bold Street feature people stepping back in time no further than when the Underground Rail system was built at the end of the 19th century. There has also been rather unsettling graffiti discovered on the walls of the Underground Rail system. One such message was discovered by a local community worker, Chris Gibson, and it read, "God have mercy on all who enter here." The ominous writing was dated February the 5th, 1966. Directly below this scrawl was another warning, dated September the 12th, 1969, and simply read, "It's no joke." Of course, such scribbles could be nothing more than the work of hoaxers and pranksters looking to tap into the legends of the area. They do, however, contribute to an overall general menacing feel that permeates this underground network. Of course, such scribbles could be nothing more than the work of hoaxers or pranksters looking to tap into the legends of the area. But for those who believe in the time slip theory, it adds a certain deeper level of mystery and intrigue to the whole case. Whether there is a connection to the Underground Rail system and the alleged mind-blowing journeys back in time along this famous Liverpudlian street or not remains unclear. But a word of advice, if you ever do find yourself shopping for food on Bold Street, when you get home, you might want to double check those best before dates. Did two women from early 20th century England temporarily travel over 100 years back in time and see Marie Antoinette sketching in her garden before her eventual execution in the French Revolution? An incident known as the Ghosts of Versailles that occurred in 1901 just outside of Versailles in France suggests that they did, and is one of the strangest cases of a time-slip encounter on record. What is particularly interesting about it, and something which almost certainly adds weight to the controversial claims, is that the witnesses were eventually revealed to be two academics who had discreetly conducted extensive research into their experience before reaching their startling conclusions. The two women, Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, the principal and vice principal respectively of St. Hugh's College in Oxford, were on vacation in France in the summer of 1901 when the incident occurred. On the morning of August the 10th, they decided to visit the gardens of Petit Trianon near Versailles. There they would be witnesses to events that would change their lives forever. Shortly after venturing into the gardens, as they attempted to locate the Petit Trianon, the two women quickly became lost. They continued walking along the path they were on. However, soon they passed an abandoned farmhouse. Nearby was an old plough that was similarly abandoned at the roadside. Stranger though, both women had the bizarre feeling that the atmosphere was suddenly heavy and that despair was almost in the air. Before they could contemplate such ideas any further, Anne and Eleanor noticed two men walking toward them. Each were wearing a long grey-green coat and had a three-cornered hat on his head. They politely asked the men for directions to the Petit Trianon and then went on their way. A few moments later, they came upon a strange gazebo set up in the shade of the trees. It was as they were looking at this gazebo that they noticed a man with a face pitted with smallpox marks just to the side, staring at them. The three of them locked stares for several seconds before one of the men from whom they had asked directions approached them to tell them they were going the wrong way. Pleased to leave the unsettling man behind, they thanked him and went in the opposite direction. They crossed over a small bridge and then finally found themselves at the Petit Trianon. There they noticed a young woman who was wearing an old-fashioned dress and a pale green scarf. She was sat on a stool and appeared to be sketching. And as they looked at her for reasons neither woman could understand, they each felt a wave of sadness run through them. They both watched the young but seemingly sad woman for several minutes before a man approached them from the doorway of a nearby building. He asked if they were lost, to which they replied they would like to see the Petit Trianon up close. The man directed them to the other side of the building, a destination they could reach through the doorway he had just emerged from. They thanked him and headed through the door. As soon as they did, the dark mood that had enveloped them almost from the moment they arrived suddenly lifted. They did eventually see the Petit Trianon, but were both privately enthralled by the adventurous walk around the gardens. So much so that several weeks later, when they were back in England, they met to discuss this affair further. The two women, both academics we might remember, had each come to the conclusion that the gardens they had walked around in France must be haunted. However, the more they discussed the notion, the more they agreed. There appeared to be much more to it than just ghosts appearing to them. These apparent apparitions were comfortable in their environment, almost as if it was Anne and Eleanor who were the intruders into their reality as opposed to the other way round. It was, however, when Eleanor was preparing a history lesson regarding the French Revolution for her pupils that one of the most startling pieces of the puzzle fell into place. She noticed the date that Tuileries Palace was stormed by revolutionaries and burned to the ground, leading to the arrests of the royal family, including Marie Antoinette, August the 10th, 1792, exactly 109 years before the visit to the gardens. What's more, closer inspections of paintings of Antoinette were an exact likeness of the woman they had seen sketching in the garden. It was their conclusion that the woman they had witnessed that day was Marie Antoinette. She was likely fully aware of her grim fate, which they believed explained the feelings of doom and depression that permeated each of their bodies and minds. She was likely, they reasoned, enjoying her last peaceful moments before the palace was stormed. Incidentally, Antoinette was executed a little over a year after her arrest in October 1793. When Eleanor returned to Versailles in January 1902, she uncovered further revelations. According to official writings and historic summaries, Antoinette was sitting exactly where she and Anne had seen her that morning, when she was informed that a mob was marching directly toward the palace. It was, the two women would later conclude, quite possible that they had witnessed her in the moments immediately after she had received the news. They would further theorize that it was this outburst of emotion and negative energy on Antoinette's part that perhaps opened some kind of doorway, one that allowed people to step back in time to that very moment. They would eventually approach the Society for Psychical Research with their findings in the hope they would conduct an investigation. However, they would decline ultimately, leaving the two women to conduct further research alone. Using pseudonyms, Miss Morrison and Miss Lamont, the two women would put their conclusions in the book An Adventure, released a decade later in 1911, and in it they made their argument. For example, they now claim to have identified the man with the pockmarked face who had been staring at them. Their research indicated that it was Comte de Vaudreuil, who was a known enemy of Antoinette's and whose description is remarkably like that given by the two women. Equally intriguing were the two men who they had asked for directions. Investigations of Marie Antoinette's Swiss guards revealed them to wear the exact same clothes that Anne and Eleanor had seen them dressed in. Even the abandoned plough was researched, with the two women finding that such ploughs were no longer present in the region at the start of the 20th century, but would have been at the time of the French Revolution. Likewise, the small bridge they crossed did very much exist in 1792, but had long since disappeared by 1901. There were, of course, many who attacked the book, not least the Society for Psychical Research, who claimed the story presented in the book was not the account offered to them previously, essentially that the two women had embellished it. The authors behind their false identities countered this charge by stating they had conducted another 10 years of research since approaching the organization, research that they required to reach their conclusions. Another researcher claimed that it was most likely the two women had simply stumbled on a themed fancy dress party and become confused. However, in 1937, with both Anne and Eleanor having passed away, they were finally revealed as the authors of An Adventure. And now with their academic status known, the case enjoyed renewed interest from both the public and paranormal researchers. So did Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain really travel back in time over 100 years to the late 18th century? We might ask, given their professional positions and social standing, why would they manufacture such an incident and risk considerable harm to their reputations? And if they did slip back to the past, what allowed them to do so? What conditions were present that day that allowed a doorway to this very specific moment over a century previously? Might these conditions still exist there today, waiting to transport another unexpected person? We might ask, given their professional positions and social standing, why would they manufacture such an incident and risk considerable harm to their reputations? And if they did slip back to the past, what allowed them to do so? What conditions were present that day that allowed a doorway to this very specific moment over a century previously? Might these conditions still exist there today, waiting to transport other unsuspecting people back to a previous era?